This is the part of the program where we're going to open it up to you for questions. So please, if anyone has a question, now's the time. I think there are folks around the room with microphones.
Hello, I'm John Rickman with FDA News. This is for a question for Mr. Dahl. I was wondering if there are any particular state laws that are standing in the way of going after these counterfeiters.
I'm not aware of any state laws that are standing in the way of the particular focus of the legislation that I discussed, the Safe Doses Act. There are state laws that may cover some or all of the behavior that the statute would contemplate, but the focus of our legislation is to modernize the federal criminal law, and an example of why it's so important to do it at the federal level in addition to the state laws. I would mention again the instance of the insulin that was stolen in North Carolina. As I mentioned, it was traced eventually to 17 states, and I think that demonstrates that although state laws are important, they vary, and it's not a matter where it makes public policy sense to rely on each state to enact the laws to protect the residents of all the other states.
Hi. Mike, can you clarify what is the status of FDA's track and trace policy? I know there was legislation years ago that was ready to set up something that never really happened, and I just saw a press report that said that you had withdrawn or canceled all your track and trace authority, and I gather you're also seeking added authority from Congress to strengthen it. So it's a little confusing.
Well, what we did recently is we withdrew a regulation that we had issued under PDMA regarding pedigree. There is still, however, a statutory pedigree requirement. In terms of track and trace, again, we had the public meeting. We're evaluating comments from the public meeting and deciding what to do next. I think our authority in that area is less than crystal clear. And so, I mean, that is, I think, open for discussion also.
Is there a question over here? Oh, I'm sorry.
Bryce Chaney, Synexus Incorporated in North Carolina. Questions for Mike. Who has the authority and legislation power when a diversion or black market comes up in the controlled substances area? So say OxyContin is found in Florida, counterfeit. Does DEA step in, or does FDA have the final authority?
Well, it would be, I mean, it could be a DEA case if there's actually a controlled substance in the counterfeit drug. If it's just a counterfeit with nothing in it, it would be an FDA case. And usually what we try to do, particularly with imports involving controlled substances, is to work closely with DEA and CBP to try to work some sort of arrangement where the drugs are seized.
Hi, another question, if I may, for Mr. Levy. You had said there have been landmines along the path. That was for track and trace. Wondering if you care to elaborate.
I said that about the secure supply chain pilot.
Oh, that's right.
And speed bumps may have been a better word. We've had problems with the Paperwork Reduction Act, and we've had problems because I think we didn't properly understand CBP's CT-PAT program. I think we have a better understanding of that program now, and we are working to meet the requirements of the Paperwork Reduction Act so that we can go forward with the program.
How has the latter tripped you up?
The Paperwork Reduction Act?
Yeah.
I'm no expert on the Paperwork Reduction Act, but generally if FDA requests any type of submission as a part of a program, it has to go through the requirements of that act.
Thank you.
There's a question back here.
Hi, I'm Gabriel Levitt from PharmacyChecker.com. My question is for Travis and for anyone else on the panel. Travis brought up the problem that consumers really don't know what they're doing when they go online, and that's why they're running into rogue sites. Pharmacy Checker evaluates online pharmacies. Some are based in the US and some are based in Canada. And we've verified that there are several online pharmacies that are not based here that do sell safe and affordable medication, and they do require a prescription. Those are the sites that Travis pointed out that, you know, sometimes they get good products and sometimes they get bad products. According to the CDC, 26 million Americans did not take a prescription drug in 2009 because they were not able to afford their medication. And the Commonwealth Fund found that 48 million people did not fill a script in 2010 because they were not able to afford their medication. Do we have any numbers on how many Americans are going online, not just to strike a deal, not just to save a few bucks, but because they cannot afford their medication here?
I wish I did, but unfortunately I have no data at all on that issue.
Question here.
Lou Kontnick with Amgen, and I want to thank you all for your input. Michael, I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on how FDA is proceeding in the area of diversion. I know there have been some recent criminal resolutions of some things. It's an item you've raised. What is the current compliance approach, and how are you working with OCI and the rest of enforcement on that?
The first thing, as you mentioned, is criminal enforcement. OCI is very active in that space, as the report shows. Secondly, to the extent that diversion results from cargo theft, we also had a public meeting earlier this year on cargo theft, and we worked with industry on best practices, and I think that industry has now published best practices on cargo theft to try to prevent it. And we're also, in terms of diversion more generally, we're in the process of trying to figure out where the weaknesses are in the supply chain and where we should be focusing our new resources.
We've got a question. Question here, then we'll get over here.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Forsley. I have a question for any of the panelists and a comment. First, on the question of why people are buying medicines online to save money, might have been answered somewhat by the BASCAP study that was done on the motivations for consumers to purchase counterfeits. And I suggest that for anyone who wants to have a look at that and the data that it offers us. Secondly, a question on the EU Metacrimes Convention as well as the Food Safety Modernization Act here in the United States. I wonder if those two pieces of legislation offer any direction for us in terms of counterfeits to broaden the regulatory scope to substandard and illegal products as well as counterfeits, number one, which is what was done in the EU Metacrimes Convention, and secondly, under the Food Safety Modernization Act, to reach back into the supply chain to limit and restrict who has the ability to bring in product. And could any of the panelists please comment on those two?
Who
I'm
wants
happy-
who wants to jump in?
Well, I guess where we've seen FSMA coming into play with imports so far is primarily in those products that are marketed as dietary supplements, but are not actually dietary supplements, but are actually active pharmaceutical ingredients. So we have been working on trying to use our new authority under FSMA to combat that type of product. The Metacrimes Convention, what I would say is that I think that generally the focus on substandard medications as opposed to counterfeit medications is a good one because it places more of an emphasis on public health, which is where we want it, as opposed to trademark infringement, which can be a problem internationally.
And I don't have an answer to your question, but did want to thank you for bringing up the BASCAP study. It's an issue I had forgotten about. And there's also another Gallup study that was published probably about 3 or 4 years ago now that had some interesting conclusions regarding consumer motivation for buying counterfeit pharmaceuticals, and in many cases, motivation for knowingly buying counterfeit pharmaceuticals. And one of the key figures that sticks out for that one is that I think was somewhere around 8% of consumers who knowingly purchased counterfeit product purchased from a street vendor. So gives you a little bit of insight into the sorts of investment they were putting into the safety and security of the product that they were trying to buy. So.
Can we go back here and then here and then here and then there? We got a number of questions, which is great.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Jim Dahl, the Global Product Security Director for Eisai Pharmaceuticals. First, a comment really from the question from a gentleman to my right that seemed to indicate that there was something safe about Canadian internet pharmacies. I've been buying drugs from Canadian internet pharmacies for 10 years, either personally or by my subordinate employees, both as an OCI agent and later as a pharmaceutical consultant, and more recently as a global product security director. One time in 10 years did I get drugs supplied from Canada. One time. Vanuatu, Fiji, India, Thailand, Spain. You get drugs from all over the world. Doesn't mean those drugs were intended for delivery or sale in those markets. But this falsehood that people try to spread, that there's something safe about putting a maple leaf on a website has got to go away. But anyway, I have a question for Mr. Levy. I'd like to hear what your thoughts about the difference between drugs that are stolen from a truck or a warehouse as opposed to those that are stolen by fraud, basically diversion, and what percentages you see, which risk might be greater and why. And then a follow-up on that is I've heard FDA commissioners, past and present, talk about the risk-based approach to inspections. And I've heard FDA say that the secondary wholesalers are a risky market. How many inspections has FDA conducted in any recent time period of secondary wholesalers? And what are the plans for the future?
I'll take the second part first. I don't know. A lot of those inspections occur, at the local district level. We don't have tabulated information about that. I will say that I would like us to be more active in inspecting distributors and wholesalers in the future in order to try to figure out, one, just to gather information about the drug supply chain, and two, to try to figure out whether they're meeting current requirements. Now the other question, do you mind just running, what, again, I'm sorry.
Well, guess what I'm getting at is although cargo and warehouse theft is an issue, there are other ways that drugs get into that secondary.
Right. And you asked me the relative risk. I mean, I think that what we're worried about in either of those cases is the same, that a drug is held in inadequate storage conditions, and that it's actively diluted. In either of those cases, I think the public health risk is the same, and I agree with you that there are, aside from cargo theft, there are other types of diversion schemes that we need to be concerned about.
We had a question over here.
Ravi Kalyan Raman, Bristol Myers Squibb, Worldwide Quality and Compliance. My question is to Mr. Mike Levy. Recently, FDA actually came out with the final version of the PCID guidelines, and it's been approved last month, I think. And I was wondering what the expectations are from the agency with regards to implementing this in the pharma industry in form of NDA. Should it be a part of NDA, or what kind of expectation? Because the guideline really doesn't say much about that. Could you please expand that?
Well, I think the guideline does, it lays out, and now it's a guidance, it's not requirements, but it does lay out, I think, if you were to submit an application at this point that involves PCID, what types of information would you submit to the agency along with that? So I think it does go into some detail on the application side of it.
Got a question here?
I do have a question for Mr. Levy, but before that, I would like to make one comment. One of the members of the audience asked a question, the predicate of which was that people go online to buy medicines because they can't afford to fill their prescriptions. I would just like to point out that, to my knowledge, every major pharmaceutical company in the U.S. does have a program to assist patients who have valid prescriptions and cannot afford them. This information is available on the website of every major manufacturer, and I believe there is even an umbrella group that can be accessed from the FDA site. So, for those of you who may know people who are going online because they think they can't afford it, there really is a safe option. And as Mr. Dahl clearly pointed out, the fact that sometimes you may get a safe, authentic medicine from the country you think you're ordering it from certainly doesn't protect those people who are not in that lucky 90%. My question for you, Mr. Levy, relates to the track and trace legislation, the track and trace regulations that the FDA is working on. Congressman Matheson mentioned some new legislation that he had introduced, and I asked him if he was aware of what would differentiate those regulations from the PDMA regulations on pedigree that have been in effect now, have been on the books now for I don't know how many years, but have never been implemented due to successful court challenges. And I was wondering if you were aware of those challenges, and if so, what steps the FDA would take to ensure that any new legislation or regulations would not meet those same problems.
Well, I'd answer that in two ways. As I mentioned before, what we've done as a result of the previous court challenges was to withdraw the rule that was challenged. But again, there is still a federal pedigree statutory requirement that is enforceable by FDA. Now that said, in order to get to full track and trace, as I mentioned earlier, I think our authority could be more clear. And so I think that's what Representative Matheson is trying to address with his legislation.
Could I just ask one follow-up on that? You say that the statute is effective, and I agree with that and enforceable. My question is FDA actually enforcing from the statute? And if so, how are you doing that? I know one of the big issues with the regulation was how far back the pedigree had to go.
Right.
Did it have to go all the way back to the manufacturer? And if so, because authorized distributors didn't have to provide that information, distributors further down in the distribution chain couldn't pass it on. So I guess my question is, given that same issue, how are you enforcing, or are you enforcing from the statute?
Well, I'd say that most of our enforcement in this area recently has been criminal. But what we're trying to do in ODSR is, what we're thinking about is whether we should be more active in terms of regular civil inspections in that area.
Thanks. Is there a question over here?
Thank you. I'm Jeannie Salo with Eli Lilly and Company, but I really want to ask this just as an average American to Mr. Levy and any of the other panelists. The average American, I don't think, even begins to have a sense of how many of the sites selling drugs online are illegitimate. And I don't think the average American would know where to go to figure out what is safe, or that a VIPS system exists, or just the sheer volume of illegitimate versus legitimate. And I'm curious if you're taking any action at the FDA to educate consumers about the risks of going online and about what tools might be available to ensure that they are getting a safe site or a legitimate site, a site that has been licensed or verified in some way. And just that the average American population understand that the internet doesn't provide any of the safety that a regular brick and mortar pharmacy has, or any of the kind of regulations or things. And there may be some Americans that are knowingly looking to skirt those, but I think there are a whole lot of Americans who don't have any idea. And I think we really need to do a better job of trying to educate average people about the severity of this issue. Thank you.
Well, I agree. We do have existing web materials on purchasing drugs online. I think the problem is getting to consumers when they are actually at the point of purchase. And that's what we're focusing on now, is trying to, what we're working on is materials that we think would be more useful to consumers when they're actually online and trying to buy a drug.
There's a question here.
Thank you. Lori Garrett from the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm a little new to this field, but I don't understand, other than the one point that Mr. Dahl made regarding plea bargaining and pressure in plea bargaining, why existing law is inadequate to deal with. If you break into a warehouse, I don't care whether you're stealing drugs or mink coats, that's illegal. If you divert a truck, I don't care whether you're diverting narcotics or computers, it's illegal. So I'm not understanding, other than this issue you raised about plea bargaining pressure, why existing law is inadequate to prevent theft of vehicles, breaking and entering into warehouses, illegal distribution of stolen goods. I thought we had a legal system that covered those things.
It's a very good question, but it goes to the nature of criminal law enforcement in general. So the question, to analogize it to something that everybody's more familiar with, would be similar to there isn't the problem of speeding or distracted driving being taken care of because states have laws against those things. It's more complicated than just having a law that makes something illegal. It's important that the people who are making a decision to engage in this kind of behavior know that there is a real chance of getting caught and getting punished in a way that they would not be happy with if they proceed along those lines. A point that Travis also made, that in essence, the goal of deterrence of the criminal laws is to raise the cost of doing business and encourage people to do something else. Right now, what they're finding is that stealing medical product cargo is a very lucrative way to make a living. And as I mentioned, a couple of cases where there have been investigations but no arrests. I mean, the people who conducted the largest pharmaceutical theft in history have not been caught. And that is bad for all of us, for those people out there to think that that is something they can do without getting caught. Or to have people not afraid of the sentences. So a criminal justice system where the rewards of engaging in the activity so outweigh the penalties that people think about and think, well, I'm not sure I'm going to get caught, and if I do, it's not much time in comparison to the amount of money involved. I would refer you, I see you shaking your head, I would refer you to a CBS News story. I'll send you the link. They interview a truck driver who he says he makes his living driving trucks, but that he has done this for illegal operations. And they ask him how much he gets paid, and he said that he's had as much as $1.5 million cash in a bag as payment for his work. And they ask him if he's afraid of getting caught, and he says, not really. That's very true. And that's why the deterrent is only one part of it. So the other parts are to make sure that law enforcement have the tools they need to bring the cases. As I mentioned, and you seem to agree with, the prospect of higher penalties is an important law enforcement tool for prosecutors to turn criminals into cooperating witnesses.
We'll continue to do so. Someone mentioned the Metacrimes Convention. That's something that's applicable to this too. You know, again, I think that what we're seeing is more of an emphasis on the substandard, sub-quality aspect of this as opposed to counterfeit. But I think that that's more likely to result in international agreements.
I really think with, you know, as far as the broad-based organizations, whether WHO, WTO, you know, WIPO, you know, all of those, really the opportunity for consensus in recent years has not been quite so good. You know,
of course, the other goal of criminal justice is that when you get to people who have decided, as you said, that the penalties don't particularly deter them from undertaking the crime. There's a certain number of those people who really need to be walled off from society and prevented in that way from undertaking more criminal activity in that area, put in jail.
I think I'd echo a lot of that, really. Yeah, and the U.S., whether criminal or civil, yeah, in the realm of counterfeiting, we have some of the best penalties available in the world. You know, up to, you know, life imprisonment in some instances. In some instances, on the criminal side, I believe Texas allows, you know, 99-year sentences for some of their counterfeiting offenses there. You know, the civil side, you're, you know, talking in millions of dollars, treble damages, you know, full restitution of any harm that's caused. But by some estimates, we also have a $250 billion consumer market for counterfeit goods in this country. So if, you know, penalties were the only solution, you would think we would be in much better shape. But, and I think I mentioned it in my comments, you know, it's, you know, a component, but there's a lot more that we really have to go into and look into to improve the situation.
There are a number of different players in these schemes, and so the person who just drives the truck may not think stealing a truck is a big deal. There are people who forge labels. There are people in these organizations who are very good at it. They are changing the lot numbers on the bottles and the expiration dates, and in some cases the amounts. So they'll change a vial of liquid that has 10 milliliters and change the label to say 100 milliliters. Those things are really very dangerous, and the person involved may think of that in a different way, that all they're doing is making a label, or to the issue of kind of related to the pedigree. Another thing that apparently is happening is people involved in these organizations are forging the shipping documents, the bills of lading, and the other pedigree documents. Somebody might not realize when they sit down at a computer to do something like that what they're doing is acting in a very important way to allow this larger criminal conspiracy to proceed. And those people need to think about the deterrent, and if that is not convincing, they need to be punished in a way that prevents them from continuing that behavior. That's the way, these are lessons learned in law enforcement in a number of previous criminal problems, racketeering, and also the illegal drug trade, the cocaine dealers and other organizations. These are the kinds of tools that have led to successful prosecutions and bringing down of some of the big drug rings.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You're the former prosecutor. I'm not. But it seems to me like if the penalties were much higher, that might present a way for law enforcement to get further back into these conspiracies. So, for instance, if the truck driver is only looking at 6 months or a year, he may just cop the plea. If he's looking at 20 years, he may put on a wire and lead you further back to somebody who's actually more of a bigger fish.
Right, that's exactly right. And again, that's something that law enforcement learned, among other ways, by bringing down drug rings. It was easy to catch the person known as the mule, the person who did nothing other than carry the bag of cocaine or something. But it took substantially increased penalties on those people before they were willing to take what's really a very serious risk for themselves, to start acting as an informant and telling law enforcement about the organization that they work for.
Yeah, I got to say, when I first started looking at this maybe 10 years ago, I was shocked to see that you could get more time, and there were more severe penalties for counterfeiting a single U.S. dime than for counterfeiting a drug product, at least under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that's something that at the time, pharma really thought ought to be changed, and thought that the penalties ought to be increased pretty significantly. Did I see a question over here? Oh, we'll go here and then here.
Hi, my name's Tim Smith, and I'm with the Canadian International Pharmacy Association. And my group are legitimate, licensed online pharmacies that have been serving millions of Americans with maintenance medications for the past decade. And the comment from Mr. Dahl that not everything that carries a maple leaf is a legitimate pharmacy is true. And we monitor that, and we maintain a list of that. And we do provide education to people who are interested in finding legitimate sources of medication. I guess my question for the panel is, in your searches, and maybe this is for Travis, but others, do you maintain a list, and are you able to distinguish between the legitimate international pharmacies and the rogues?
Well, thankfully, I am generally not tasked with the investigative side, so I have a bit easier job just dealing with, Congress than tracking down the fake pharmacies. But, the kind of tangential, affiliation I've had, working with some of our investigators and working with our member companies, it's certainly a difficult task. And I, would go back to the comment earlier about the Canadian maple leaf flag not necessarily indicating that the product was, from Canada. I think the biggest part, whether for professionals or for consumers, and identifying what's real and what's not, is that the availability of anonymity on the internet is just beyond all understanding. Really, you can be living in one country, register a domain in another country with a proxy service in that country, giving the impression to anybody who actually takes the effort to look up the site and try to track down the ownership to believe that, the, company is actually based in that site. You order a product, you get a, statement from your credit card company and, packaging, invoices that are all coming out in Chinese characters, and, leads you to believe that, you probably didn't get that package from Vancouver. But it's an incredibly difficult job, determining what's, who were the real guys and who were the fake guys. And, there's, wonderful programs like VIPS that are available to, help consumers. I think we would be seriously benefited if we could, get that message out to consumers a little bit more. It's, certainly an issue probably above my pay grade.
We got a couple of questions. Okay, we'll go here and then two over here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Bill Rosigliano from Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals, and I have a question and a comment. First, the comment. I'm hearing things about catching the bad guy, which is always a good thing, and then we're talking also about protecting the patient, which is probably our #1 goal, and they're connected to a degree. But my question is going to be around the track and trace system that you showed us a brief slide of, Mr. Levy. And one of the key components of the track and trace system, as I saw it there, is authentication, and particularly authentication at the point of dispensing. Having been involved with some conversations around these track and trace technologies, et cetera, how realistic do you think it is that pharmacies will buy into that concept? And what authority does the FDA have over pharmacies to enforce them complying to an authentication at the point of dispensing? I'm going to take that just a little bit further, because we're talking about online pharmacies as well and how to protect the patient from buying illegal drugs online. Some African nation countries are giving the patient the option to authenticate their drugs with a very simple technology of scratching off a number, revealing that number, sending a text message, and then getting a reply, to determine whether that's a legitimate drug or not. When we talk about the supply chain, we tend to stop at the pharmacy and don't go all the way to the consumer. Any thoughts about how we can, whatever technologies we deploy, we can also allow an educated consumer to also play a part in the role of protecting themselves?
Well, I mean, I see this as a multi-layered defense system, right? I mean, this is, we have PCID on the tablet itself. We have, hopefully, we have some sort of track and trace mechanism on the package. And then I think in this country, at least the last resort would be the consumer. Now, do we have any active systems for consumer recognition of authentic drugs in this country right now? No, I don't think so. But we have discussed that African model and whether it could be applicable in the U.S.
In the pharmacy portion, do you think that we have a realistic expectation that pharmacies will authenticate product at the point of dispensing in the relatively near future?
I really can't predict that. I don't know.
There's a question over here.
Good morning. My name is Rich Lamagna. I'm an IP and Internet safety consultant. I'd like to address the issue of the payment card industry and payments. It's been my experience in doing a lot of test purchases and online investigations that the so-called online pharmacies will only accept 2 or 3 major credit cards. Without that, they really wouldn't be able to operate. I'm just wondering if you could comment on the current state of cooperation with the payment card industry. They are primarily American companies that are accepted by the online pharmacies. It seems that we would have an opportunity in the enforcement domain to do more if cooperation with those companies were effective. And I was wondering if you could please comment on that.
Actually, we're making quite a bit of headway, and I think we've been very pleased with the cooperation we've seen thus far. At this point, we're not quite ready to actually roll out the program, but we have sign letters of intent, agreements in principle. I can't remember exactly how we're characterizing them at the moment, but with Visa International and Visa Europe, MasterCard, worldwide. I believe we're probably within a week away from finally reaching an agreement with American Express, although they tend to show up a little bit less frequently than the other two, and also have reached an agreement with PayPal as well for the sites that would be accepting that sort of payment. Would expect we're probably going to broaden it a bit more to include both Discover and companies like Western Union, MoneyGram, things of that nature. But kind of the premise that we've been following is if the sites are requesting a type of payment that your average consumer isn't carrying in their pocket, they're going to think twice about making the purchase. If they have to go to the store and send a MoneyGram, or if they have to wire money directly to a bank account, that's not the way legitimate businesses operate generally. When they're dealing with consumers, and it's not something that we're expecting consumers to really want to transition into. The cooperation industry-wide, I think, has been really unprecedented, and we've heard all of the right things and seen all of the right action to back that up from our partners on that side of the equation. It's really something that I think we think holds a lot of promise.
Randall Burgess with Reconnaissance International. There was a time when currency counterfeiters operated with impunity, and now we have international laws, treaties against currency counterfeiting. We have international treaties against human trafficking. Is there any effort to advance the counterfeiting of medicines as an international crime? And if not, who could best take up that cause?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, I don't. It's outside of my field.
Well, I know that we have worked very closely with WHO on counterfeit medicines.
And I think the door is open probably for something perhaps a pharmaceutical version of the ACTA agreement that was conducted as a multilateral outside that.
Under things that are currently covered under TRIPS or ACTA. Mm-hmm. What I mean is a substandard is probably maybe a better choice, but I don't like the word substandard because I like the word counterfeit because that implies that there was a malicious intent. And in much of the world, we have generics are heavily counterfeited. Now, there may be an issue with substandards, but I think that we need to examine this outside of ACTA and outside of TRIPS.
We got a question over here.
I'm still Michelle Forsley, and I'm going to double dip. The topic of why law enforcement doesn't seem to take that truck driver and see that truck driver as part of a larger conspiracy is intriguing to me. And I wonder if that's because prosecutors who have many, many demands upon their time and resources, we put that aside for the moment, that they may not quite see the activity in which that truck driver sits as part of something that has wide societal consequences. I mean, we seem to have figured out that raping children is a really bad thing to do, and all of us are offended when that happens. But we haven't quite figured out how to convey that truck driver's activity, because he's moving a bunch of boxes around of counterfeit drugs, is as offensive to us as a society. But I'd like to share that there are now some studies that demonstrate pretty conclusively that counterfeit medicines, in particular malaria medicines, have led to drug-resistant malaria, for which our current most advanced treatments have no substitute if those become useless to us. And some other trends are beginning to emerge where we can see extremely severe consequences to wider population groups than just the individual who took the drug. And that in and of itself should be bad enough. But I wonder if you could comment, Mr. Dahl in particular, since you're the prosecutor up there, on what is it that gets to the mindset of the prosecutor to take that next step? Is that prosecutor unaware of the wider societal consequences? And how do we get him to understand, him or her to understand that, just as he would be offended when a child is molested? How do we see society as offended?
Well, thank you. I don't think that the problem is one of the mindset of the prosecutors. I think it is a problem of the tools that they have in front of them to deal with. When a defendant pleads straight up to, as they say in the business, to the indictment or the criminal charge, that's the end of the case. And so the importance isn't to change the mindset, but rather to give the prosecutors the ability to start making a case out of that, out of finding one or two of those people. In the same way as Scott mentioned earlier, that in the early drug cases that we were talking about earlier, catching what the person known as a mule, someone who's just carrying something, when they pled guilty, there's just no ability, they have no incentive, interest, compulsion. They obviously never have to say anything at all about whether or not they committed any crime, and that's a very important part of our justice system. So it's, again, it's not so much a mindset issue, but rather trying to make sure that they have several levers in front of them that they can pull in appropriate ways to build cases when they get an individual who has a smaller role. But the bigger picture is that the laws that could be used today in those cases are laws about stealing trucks in interstate commerce and stealing goods in interstate commerce, and they make no distinction between the nature of those products, so electronics or clothing or whatever, isn't part of the elements of the crime. It isn't part of the purpose of the statute to make to distinguish in any way among those kinds of things. So that's why the coalition believes it's important to modernize the criminal law to make sure that the law contemplates that this is part of a larger and organized crime, so that prosecutors and law enforcement people can build cases. The fact is that they've responded very well and very appropriately when these incidents have occurred, but at the end of the day, there have been few arrests and lighter penalties than the coalition members generally believe is an appropriate deterrence and punishment.
I see I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'll just add one thing on that, which is, I mean, most first-time offenses under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic now are misdemeanors. So it can be difficult to convince local prosecutors to bring misdemeanor cases. And so I do think with increased penalties that could lead to more cases under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and more deterrence.
So we unfortunately have come to the end of our time for the first panel. I want to thank all of you. You were just a wonderful audience. I didn't have to pull out a single one of my moderator's questions, which was great. So please join me in thanking this wonderful panel, even though it does include two lobbyists. Thanks.